Good evening. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Tonight begins our a three-night lecture series that we have named in honor of Sister Elizabeth Ireland, a longtime dedicated member here at the Ebenezer Baptist Church West. And she was one who loved young people. And I could think of no better person or name for us to attach to this series other than Sister Ireland, because of all that she did for so many people, not just for children. She just had a particular love and fondness for young people. So in pulling together this series, I wanted it to specifically speak to Black history. There's so much going on, particularly in our neighboring state of Florida, where they're teaching things like the things that Black folk benefited from and learned in slavery, as though he is an authority. But there's so much rich history, so many contributions that have been made by Blacks that is not limited to Black history. It is American history. We have made an indelible contribution to the shaping and the molding of this country. And so I'm not going to belabor the moment, but what I do want to do is to bring forward the one who's going to talk to us tonight, share with us about the civil rights movement. And I will allow him the opportunity to share with us exactly what he'll be talking on the civil rights movement. But he is none other than our dear friend, our brother, right here at the Ebenezer Baptist Church West, Dr. Robert Pratt. Hear ye him. Yes, sir. You got that pen. You gonna clip it on your
How does this work?
or drop it in there?
I got it with my.
Okay.
This will work.
Yeah.
Y'all hear me?
You want me to put it? Look at that.
How's that?
Pretty Ricky.
All right. Good. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out. My capable assistant, she upstairs ready to go? All right. Before we start, I have, first of all, some opening. How much time do I have? Okay. I got my phone up here, it's on mute. I could talk till about 11 or 12 o'clock, some of this stuff. I don't want to try your patience. When I walked into the sanctuary this evening, I looked around and I saw some images on these easels. It's a reminder of the way things used to be. Wasn't that long ago. And if our people sit on their keisters in November, we'll soon find ourselves back. There is a white Christian nationalist movement in this country. White Christian nationalism is a euphemism for racist fascism and totalitarianism. And if we don't mobilize and organize, we're going to find ourselves in some deep trouble. What I want to do this evening for the few minutes that I have is to focus attention primarily on some people who are from the civil rights movement that you may not have heard. Some of them you will recognize. And I have put together a slideshow that will show you images, but I have deliberately left off names. So if you recognize any of these people, just raise your hand when you see them and feel free to share. But we often say during February, during our recognition and acknowledgement of Black History Month, that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And indeed we do. But we stand on the shoulders of a lot of giants, much more so than we realize, because things that took place in the 1950s had what I refer to as historical antecedents. Things don't just happen. When we talk about the civil rights movement in this country, we generally think of the things, the events that kicked off the movement. The first thing that comes to mind is the Brown decision of 1954. May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that segregated education was a violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And then in 1955, there were two events, one in August, one in December. Emmett Till, 14-year-old black boy from Chicago, was murdered in Money, Mississippi. The sign that welcomed people into that town of Money said, "A good place to raise a boy." Wasn't good for him. Quite the irony. That was in August 1955, and a few months later, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. That's when we usually start the civil rights movement. But in the past 20 years or so, historians have moved to reimagine the civil rights movement in something we now call the long civil rights movement, because there were people defying segregation, racism, Jim Crow, long before folk in the 1950s. And so with that introduction, I'll start my PowerPoint. Dr. Angela Vincent has agreed to be my able assistant. Anybody recognize this woman? All right. It's going to be fun. Ida B. Wells Barnett, born in Mississippi. What's important about her is that she was a lifelong civil rights activist. She was a journalist. She was so fearful of her life because there had been so many threats on her life by the Klan that she had to write under a pen name, Iola. And she urged black people to leave the South because they said the South is for us. They are killing us down here. When two of her good friends were murdered because they had the audacity to open a supermarket with the white supermarket across the street. Whites killed them. What's important to remember about Barnett, my mic is coming in and out, is that she devoted her life to writing about racial injustice. She was an anti-lynching activist. Black folk were lynched in great numbers. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But Ida B. Wells, in 1884, she was on a train, and she had purchased a first-class ticket. And the white conductor ordered her to move to the smoker's car. She refused, and when he tried to force her physically, she bit the back of his hand. She was forcibly removed from the train, but she sued and won in lower court. Tennessee's Supreme Court overturned her victory. But the point to make here about Ida B. Wells Barnett, and I could lecture an hour and a half about her, but I got 28 slides and 45 minutes. Ida B. Wells refused to give up her seat on a train in 1884. That was 71 years before Rosa Parks. Okay. Jackie Robinson. We know Jackie Robinson for integrated Major League Baseball in 1947. 1944, Jackie Robinson was court-martialed because he refused his seat on a bus. Okay. So, we go back. Please. Who is this man? Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson had a rich, beautiful baritone. Broadway actor, Hollywood star, beautiful voice. I suspect many of you, if you're older than I am or my age, you've heard Paul Robeson perform. Beautiful, rich voice. Did you know that Paul Robeson was a civil rights activist? He made the mistake of going to Russia to give a concert and to attend a peace concert in Paris. And he had been treated very well by Russia. Of course, obviously eager to poke fun at U.S. racism. Paul Robeson came back to the United States saying how well he was treated in the Soviet Union. The United States liked that. The State Department seized his passport. and they prevented him from making a living. Paul Robeson went from making $100,000 a year, which is pretty good money in the 1930s. He went from making $100,000 a year to less than $3,000. This man's career was eventually destroyed by the U.S. government and by the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover figures prominently in all of these stories. J. Edgar Hoover was the director of the FBI for about 50 years. He cut his teeth on Marcus Garvey. That's how he started. He went from Marcus Garvey to Martin Luther King. Everything in his mind was that the civil rights movement is communist inspired. Black people in this country did not need anybody from Russia to tell them that they were oppressed. But that was Hoover, and that was his lifelong vendetta against people like Paul Robeson. Next slide, please. Any guesses? Who's heard of Thurgood Marshall? You know Thurgood Marshall? First black to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court? That's not Thurgood Marshall. That's Thurgood Marshall's teacher. That's Charles Hamilton Houston. Charles Hamilton was born in Washington, D.C. in 1895. He was the first African American to get a law degree from Harvard. He was also the first black to edit the Harvard Law Journal. Barack Obama was the first to be the president of the Harvard Law Journal. He taught law, actually revamped the law school curriculum at Howard University, HBCU in D.C. And Charles Houston trained a cadre of young black attorneys. Thurgood Marshall was his star pupil. And he trained a series of young black lawyers. He says, a lawyer is either a social engineer committed to social justice, or he is a parasite on society. He says, unlike doctors, lawyers cannot bury their mistakes. We have to fight for justice. This man literally worked himself to death. He worked 16, 17-hour days. He didn't hang out much at social clubs, didn't do cocktail parties. He worked as if he knew his time was short. Charles Houston died of heart failure in 1950. He was 54 years old. At the time of his death, he looked like a man 75, 80. Literally worked himself to death. But he taught a generation of black people, black, carry on the struggle for equality in the years after he had gone. That's why he is referred to as the man who killed Jim Crow. He was the one that taught Thurgood Marshall was his star pupil. Next slide, please. Any bells? Any ideas? At some point, I'm happy to make this PowerPoint available to you with the names attached, so you can Google and do more information, more research on your own. This man is Harry T. Moore. He's one of the people I love to talk about. Harry T. Moore was from Florida, Central Florida, Mims, Broward County, a place called Live Oak. He was a school teacher. He had a little bit of money. He'd even invested in an orange grove. He was what white folk call an uppity nigger. He was eventually hired by the NAACP to be a field secretary. He went around investigating unsolved, suspicious murders of black people in Florida. What a lot of people don't know about the state of Florida. Florida was the third state after South Carolina and Mississippi to secede from the Union. Florida's Ku Klux Klan in the 1930s and 40s was one of the most dangerous in the country. By 1930, 4,000 black people had been lynched in the South, many of those in Florida. In 1930, Florida had the highest number of lynchings per capita of any southern state. But for a long time, Florida tried to revamp or resurrect its image by projecting itself as a place where you go to the beaches. So you think of Florida, you think of beaches, you think of orange groves, you think of Disney. But you don't think about the number of black folks swinging from trees in Florida. Harriet Moore went around investigating these murders, and he caught the attention of the Ku Klux Klan. But his greatest claim to fame was that he organized something called the Florida Progressive Voters League. Under his guidance, the number of black registered voters in Florida grew within 5 years from less than 5% to 35%. He said, voting is the key to our liberation. Voting is the key. Everywhere he went from town to town, organizing blacks in various places, getting them to register, getting them on the rolls, Klan followed him. December 25th, Christmas night, 1951. Dynamite explodes underneath his bedroom. He's killed instantly. His wife, Harriet, suffered grave injuries. She would die 8 days later. Harry T. Moore was the first NAACP official to lose his life in the line of duty. Nobody knows his name. He and his wife, Harriet, to this day remain the only husband-wife couple to be killed in the civil rights movement. But if you begin dating the civil rights movement in 1954, you don't know about Harry T. Moore, who was murdered on Christmas night, 1951. Next slide, please. Recognize this man? Who's heard of Martin Luther King Jr.? Everybody? No, that ain't Martin Luther King. That ain't Martin Luther King. That ain't Daddy King either. Martin Luther King was in the pulpit, the senior pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church from 1954 to 1960. By 1960, his civil rights work had become so heavy that he could not pastor a church full-time anymore, so he resigned his pastorate in 60 and went on to join his father, M.L. King Sr., Daddy King, at Ebenezer, where the two of them would co-pastor until King's assassination in 68. This man right here is Vernon Johns, the Reverend Dr. Vernon Johns. Now, he was made famous or immortalized in a made-for-TV movie starring James Earl Jones. You remember the movie. James Earl Jones played this man. Vernon Johns was once considered to be the angriest preacher in America because he challenged his congregation at Dexter to get off their lazy behinds and do something. He said, my daddy always said, if you see a good fight, get in it. He thought that the parishioners at Dexter were more concerned about who was wearing what, about losing what little they, because Dexter's congregation, they were elitist, black middle class. The term that the great writer Zora Neale Hurston once would refer to as the niggerati. Okay. The creme de la creme. They didn't want to rock the boat because they didn't want to risk losing what they had. They didn't want to affront the white power structure. But Vernon Johns challenged them Sunday after Sunday. He said, if you haven't found a reason to die, you're not fit to live. And he challenged that congregation. Gradually, he moved them. Now, eventually, he offended the deacons. The deacons said, you got to go. We're just not ready for your activism. And so Vernon Johns was eventually forced to resign the pulpit. But he is important because many people believe, I among them, King came right after him. King was militant too, but King was more sophisticated than Vernon Johns. Vernon Johns would walk into the pulpit with boots on but no strings. He would grow cat and bits and collar back in the parsonage. He said he would say everything except whiskey and preceptives. That's the kind of man. He was earthy, but he was a scholar. But he was a little bit too rough around the edges for Dexter. By the time King came, Dexter's congregation was ready to embrace him. And many people believe that but for Vernon Johns coming first, King's whole history and trajectory might have been different. And that's why Vernon Johns referred to as the father of the civil rights movement. Next slide, please. You'll know that face. Next slide. You see him in the coffin. Now, nobody would publish this picture of his battered corpse except Jet magazine. Jet magazine said, black folk need to see this. This is what they do to us in Mississippi. You know the story of Emmett Till. Next slide. You know his story. This is the man that Emmett Till was visiting, his great uncle, Mose Wright. Next slide. Mose Wright did something in 1955 that most black folk were not prepared to do. He stood up in court and he pointed out the two white men would come to his house. He said, that man right there came to my house. He had a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. And asked for Emmett Till. He had the courage in 1955 to stand up in court in his broken English and point his hand and say, Dahi. He pointed to him. Now, for his bravery, his reward was that he had to leave the state of Mississippi. Klan told him they would kill him if he stayed. He spent the rest of his life in Chicago. But it was his courage that at least made a difference in some respect, because he stood by himself in 1955. He was one man. Things didn't change. But a few months later in Montgomery, Alabama, when a lot of black folks stood up, things began to change. Next slide, please. Y'all know Rosa? Print it. Next slide. Know him? That's E.D. Nixon, Edward Daniel Nixon. E.D. Nixon was one of the most prominent black men in Montgomery, probably in the whole state. He was president of the local NAACP. He was head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the oldest black trade union, founded by A. Philip Randolph. He was the prime mover and shaker in Montgomery politics. He was the one that Rosa Parks called the night she got arrested. She said, Mr. Nixon, they've arrested me. Because he was black, he could not go down and bail her out. He had to get a white lawyer, Clifford Durr, to go with him to bail Rosa Parks out of jail. Next slide, please. Joanne Gibson Robinson. Long before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus, the Women's Political Council in Montgomery had been organizing to do the very same thing. There was a black girl named Claudette Colvin who had refused to give up her seat several months before Rosa Parks. Claudette Colvin was a teenager. She was pregnant, out of wedlock. Baby's father was a married man. And she cursed those white Montgomery officers something terrible when they arrested her. NAACP didn't think she'd make a good witness. Said, we ain't gonna move with your case. But Rosa Parks, quiet, seamstress, well-respected, she made the test case, and that's why they chose to go with her case. But Joanne Gibson Robinson was among the women. Understand that the Montgomery bus boycott would never have gotten off the ground but for the women organized behind the scene, women like Joanne Gibson Robinson. Was chosen to lead the boycott, but the boycott was already well underway when King was chosen to lead it. The reason they chose King was because there was a power play. Some of the senior black ministers wanted to lead at one church, others wanted to lead the other church. They said, let's get King. He's new in town. And as E.D. Nixon said, he hadn't been here long enough for the city fathers to put their hands on him. That's why King was chosen at the age of 26. Next slide. That's Fred Gray. Fred Gray was Martin Luther King's personal attorney. Despite the fact that black folks stayed off of Montgomery's buses for over a year, racism and segregation was so entrenched in Montgomery, Alabama, that whites would not give in. The mayor wouldn't give in, council wouldn't give in. NAACP had to file a suit in federal court. That was the man that filed it, Fred Gray. Fred Gray broke down segregation all across the state of Alabama in his hometown of Tuskegee. How many of you familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study? Black men who had syphilis, government agencies, even after they had penicillin, would not give it to them because they wanted to see how syphilis affected dead black people. It was a 40-year death watch. It started in 1932. It didn't end until 1972 when a white man named blew the whistle and told the country what the health department was doing. A 40-year death watch, watching black men die. Fred Gray was their lawyer. He filed the lawsuit against the government. And there you see him being awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Joe Biden. Fred Gray is one of the few people from that era who is still alive. He is 93. I was in Tuskegee about 6 years ago. His wife had been deceased for some years, but I went to visit him, and he was a little bit late getting to the meeting, and his daughter came and said, "I'm sorry, but Dad is in court. He's still practicing law." About 85, 86 years old. This was some years ago. He may have retired now at 93. Next slide, please. A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph is often referred to as the Dean of the Civil Rights Movement. He was the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids because black folk, men and women, would be abused when they worked for the Pullman Company. And he organized this first black union. A. Philip Randolph was probably the most prominent African American during the 1930s and 40s. He threatened then President Franklin Roosevelt that he would have a march on Washington if he did not desegregate the defense industries. And America was at war in World War II. And because of his threat to march on Washington, in 1941, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which ended segregation in defense industries. He threatened again when President Truman came on board. And because of his threats to march, Truman issued Executive Order 9981 that desegregated the military. But because most of the generals in the military were white Southerners, they resisted segregation. They resisted integration for as long as they could. And so although the military was desegregated in 1948, there would be no real integration in the ranks until Vietnam because of the resistance of white Southern generals. This man is the Dean of the Civil Rights Movement. The March on Washington in 1963 was his idea. It wasn't King's idea. A. Philip Randolph was the brainchild of the March on Washington. He wanted to march for jobs. When he invited King to be a part of it, King said, let's broaden it and make it a march for jobs and freedom. Next slide, please. You're close. As Bayard Rustin. There is a new movie on him. I think it's in the theaters now. Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was the architect of the March on Washington. He was the one that, how we gonna get 200,000 plus people to DC? Cars, buses, trains, planes. How many cheese sandwiches we gonna need? He organized the whole march from 3x5 cards in the back of his pocket. Because it wasn't in the cell phones. No Twitter, no YouTube, none of that stuff, no email. Just 3x5 cards in the back of his pocket. He organized it. He was a pacifist, opposed to violence. He was a strict disciple of Gandhi, believed in nonviolent protest. King had heard of him, and so he went to visit King during the height of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And he was taken aback when he found out that King had a gun in his house. King said, I'm nonviolent, but I ain't no fool. I got a wife and 4 children to protect. And Rustin said, no, you can't have it both ways. You believe in nonviolence or you don't. And so he chastised King. But he was invaluable to the movement. But Bayard Rustin had to live most of his life in the shadows because he had once upon a time been affiliated with the Communist Party and because he was openly gay. J. Edgar Hoover told King, if you keep Rustin around you, I'm going to put out a rumor that you and Rustin are lovers. And he was. But Bayard Rustin really was the architect of the March on Washington. And he was indispensable as an advisor to the King. But for various reasons, had to live his life in the shadows. Next slide, please. You see King, the man next to him. Anybody know? It's the Reverend James Lawson. Ever hear of him? James Lawson was a divinity student at Vanderbilt in Nashville. He too was a staunch disciple of Mohandas Gandhi and nonviolence in India, so much so that he traveled to India, spent several years in India, studying Gandhi's tactics. He came back to the States. He settled in Ohio. He and King had a chance meeting. King learned of his work. King said, you need to come south. You could use a man. And so he came to Tennessee, Nashville. And you know about the sit-ins at the lunch counters. This is the man that trained the students. He trained them in the principles of nonviolence. How do you conduct yourself when you are having ketchup and mustard poured on your head? When you're being called everything but a child of God? How do you resist the urge to strike back? You couldn't just go and take a seat on a lunch counter. You had to be trained. You had to be disciplined. And he was the man that taught them that discipline. Because of his actions in the civil rights movement, Vanderbilt University said, we don't need you here. They expelled him, kicked him out. Fast forward 20-some years later, Vanderbilt issued him a public apology and invited him to have a position on their faculty, which he held as a professor for many years before he retired. But in an interesting twist of fate, King had invited Lawson to come south. Lawson did. When garbage workers went on strike demanding better wages and better treatment in Memphis in 1968, Lawson invited King to Memphis. You know that story ends. But he had his appointment with destiny. Next slide. Robert F. Williams. Nowhere in the annals of history does the record show a people delivered from bondage by patience alone. Not all black folk were nonviolent. Not all black folk were nonviolent. Robert F. Williams was the head president of the NAACP chapter in Monroe, North Carolina. When the Freedom Riders came through North Carolina, Robert F. Williams and other black folk had guns. They said, if the Klan come after you, we will protect you. We'll take care of Klansmen. And Williams was known. Understand that King's philosophy of nonviolence held sway for many in the South and for some in the North, but it didn't convince everybody. And Robert F. Williams was one of those people that says, no, we're not going to be beaten the rest of our lives. Next slide. These armed brothers, this is actually taken from a movie, they were organized in Jonesboro, Louisiana in 1964. But their largest chapter was in Bogalusa, Louisiana. They're known as the Deacons for Defense. They are known as the Deacons for Defense because most of them were deacons in their church. And many of them had been World War II veterans. They knew how to use machine guns, hand grenades, all weapons of war. And they were tired of being brutalized by white people in the Klan and down in Louisiana. And so one night they got together, they had a church meeting like we're doing right now. And they had all been war veterans, and they said, we're going to organize. We're tired of white folk beating us. Well, what are we going to call ourselves? He said, we're going to call ourselves the Deacons for Defense, because we are righteous brothers for a righteous cause. The Deacons would clash with the Klan in Louisiana and Mississippi in 1964. It's the closest we have come to a race war. And it was because of that confrontation in the South that the federal government finally decided to put some teeth into the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. You know those brothers, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, Black Panther Party for self-defense. Okay, now go back to the previous slide. This is the original Black Panther Party. Black people in Lowndes County, Alabama, organized a political party. They said, we need to have political rights in this county, and we need a party that represents us. Now, the symbol of the Republican Party is the elephant. The symbol for the Democratic Party, which at that time was Southern racist, white supremacy party, is that rooster that's got a band over, you can't read it, but the band over his head says, white supremacy. That was the symbol of Alabama's political party in 1865. So the folk in Lowndes County said, we need to have a party and a symbol that represents us. Now, there are some black folk in this county that cannot read and write. But if they can't read and write, they sure know the difference between an elephant and a rooster and a black cat. And so they chose the Black Panther as their symbol, 1965. Next slide. When Bobby Seale and Huey Newton decided to organize in Oakland, California in 1966, they contacted the folk in Lowndes County and said, can we appropriate your symbol and use it as our own? And Lowndes County folks say, well, of course. And so that's the real history behind the formation of the Black Panther Party. Next slide. I'm moving on down. You know Medgar. Medgar was one of my heroes because I cannot think of anybody in the civil rights movement who had a more dangerous job. It's almost, I think of him, I thought of him a lot recently since the death of Alexei Navalny in Russia. When you work and commit your life to a cause and you know you're going to die. There ain't many people do that. I don't know if I had the nerve to do it. You commit yourself to a cause and you know they're going to kill you. What job could be more dangerous than being the head of the NAACP in Mississippi? Mississippi had the reputation of being the most racist state in the Union. The common riddle was, what has 4 eyes but cannot see? Mississippi. Birmingham had the reputation of being the worst city. I ran into Fred Shuttlesworth about 10 years ago. He was in Montgomery. I said, you're not in Birmingham? He said, no, that's where hell used to be. Birmingham, but Mississippi, the worst state. And he was murdered, as you know, June 11th, 1963, shot to death, getting out of his car, going to his home, leaving behind his wife, Merle, and their children. But I can think of nobody more dedicated to the cause. This man knew that his time was limited. He was killed at age 37. Next slide. I had to put him up there. He is not a civil rights activist. That's Richard B. Russell. And just about everything around here bears his name. But for all of the resistance and the recalcitrance and the opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there he is. He was the leader of the Southern Bloc. Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond, all those other cats, they fell in line, just like they're doing now in the House of Representatives. Richard B. Russell was their man, Georgia's native son. Next slide. You know those. The single most heinous act of the civil rights movement took the lives of those 4 girls on September 15, 1963, in 16th Street Baptist Church. I walked in this evening, I saw these signs that made me think of this. Black church, the 50s and 60s, were where black people went to organize. They organized in black churches because they were one of the few things that black folk controlled, their own churches. And because so much civil rights activism and planning and organizing took place in black churches were targets. Churches in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, bombed routinely. When the 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, they had gone just earlier that day to investigate a church bombing in Mississippi. Klansmen were responsible for this dastardly deed. Those 4 black girls were killed. Several others were injured. And many of them, there are many martyrs of the civil rights movement. Not all lost their lives. Some people were scarred psychologically and lived in fear for the rest of their lives. Next slide. Fannie Lou Hamer. She was a firebrand of Sunflower County, Mississippi, home of then Senator James O. Eastland. Fannie Lou Hamer was a leading player in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The Democrats had their national convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1964. And she was one of the principal speakers. And this is her giving testimony to the Credentials Committee at the Democratic National Convention. Everybody knew Hamer was a powerful speaker. And so when it was announced that she was going to speak before the Credentials Committee, President Lyndon Johnson, fearful of losing white support, hastily called a press conference. So all the cameras were turned to him and away from Hamer, which they did. But he didn't know that later on that night, all of the networks would run her testimony, where she talked about being beaten in jail cells in Winona, Mississippi, and how she had to sleep with her phone off the hook every night because of death threats. Fannie Lou Hamer died in 1997, I believe. She was 59. She died from breast cancer. Next slide. These are the 3 martyrs of Selma. Jimmy Lee Jackson is the black fellow at the top, James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo. Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered not in Selma, but in nearby town Marion, Alabama. That's Coretta Scott King's hometown, Marion. It was a nighttime march. Nighttime march is always dangerous. Bad stuff happened in nighttime marches. They were marching that night, and Klansmen came up and hoodlums. So the cameras, the media were present, but what they would often do, they would spray paint on the lens so you couldn't see what happened. White policemen started to beat his grandfather and his mother. He went to try to protect them, and he was shot twice, stomach, point blank range. He died several days later. It was his death in Marion that was the catalyst for the march from Selma to Montgomery. Some of the organizers say we should take Jimmy Lee Jackson's body and take it and carry it to the foot of the Capitol in Montgomery and dump it right at George Wallace's doorstep. That became the catalyst. You see, let's do that. We won't take him in a literal sense, but let's march from Selma to Montgomery. The first march, you know, ended in disaster. That's Bloody Sunday. I would show you some footage, but you've seen it already. And King then asked as many people as who could stay to come to stay, and they would do a march on Tuesday. It was at that march that the Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian minister, he and two of his white associates, a lot of white missionaries and ministers came from all across the country to be a part of the Selma campaign. Reeb and two other white ministers had dinner at a black home. A woman named Amelia Boynton, Asa's left, his aunt, I believe. Amelia Boynton and her husband Sam were powers in Selma. And they were the ones who really got the Selma campaign kicked off. When Amelia Boynton's husband Sam died, she used the opportunity of his funeral to pass out voter registration cards. That's how committed she was. They had dinner at her home, and these three they had got lost, and they made a wrong turn down the street, went past the Silver Moon Cafe, one of the most racist establishments in Selma. They were approached by a group of white men. One of them carried a club and hit James Reeb in his head with the full impact, and he died several days later. The woman is Viola Liuzzo, only white woman to be killed in the civil rights movement. When the march from Selma to Montgomery had ended that night with King giving his majestic speech in Montgomery, they had gone from Selma to Montgomery. Then begins the task of getting people back into Selma. And so several people were volunteering their cars to drive people back to Selma. Viola Liuzzo was a housewife from Michigan because she had seen the racist violence on TV to do something about it. And so she offered to put her car in the carpool. James Orange, one of King's top lieutenants, said, "No, Ms. Vi, I don't think you should do that because your car got out-of-state tags. You easy target." But she was insistent. And so she and a black passenger named Leroy Moulton began taking passengers back. They had made a trip back into Selma. On the way back to Montgomery to get more passengers, a carload of Klansmen drove up beside them, shot in the car. She was killed instantly. Next slide. That is her black passenger, Leroy Moulton. He survived that night without a scratch. He survived by playing dead. When the Klansman shot into the car went off the highway because Viola Liuzzo was driving. She lost control. They were both thrown from the car. The Klansman doubled back. And one of them took out a gun and said, "I'm going to plug that nigger again." And another Klansman said, "Oh, he's dead. When I shoot him, I'm a show shot. Don't worry about it. He's dead." They got in the car and left. I've often wondered if I could have stayed as still as Leroy Moulton. But that's how he survived. And it was because of his testimony that some of the Klansmen were eventually brought to justice. Next slide. Fred Hampton. Movie made about him, I think it was last year, Judas and the Black Messiah. Fred Hampton was the leader of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. He was young, he was dynamic, he was charismatic, he was one of the most exciting speakers I've ever heard. He could enthrall a crowd. Black people loved him. He could reach across all ages, genders. He was even having success at getting warring factions of street gangs in Chicago to make peace. But he was seen as a threat to the establishment in Chicago. December 4th, 1969, while he was in his apartment sleeping, members of the Chicago police, in collusion with members of the FBI, went into his house and murdered him. They killed him and his associate, a man named Mark Clark. Now, the FBI and Chicago police said that they were acting in self-defense. But you show up at this man's house at 4 o'clock. Later ballistics tests proved that there were 120-some shots fired into that apartment. All but one came from the outside. He was murdered. And that's what the FBI did. It murdered people who got in the way or sowed seeds of dissension. Next slide. That's to the left, you've got two gentlemen sitting. That's Fred Hampton sitting to the right, and that to the left with the glasses is Bobby Rush. That's not Bobby Rush, the blues singer. Y'all know Bobby Rush? The blues singer. His name is also Bobby Rush. He was one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party in Illinois in the 60s. That is his picture to the right, and that's the color photo of Bobby Rush. Bobby Rush has a singular distinction of being the only politician ever to defeat Barack Obama. He and Barack Obama opposed each other for the 1st District congressional seat in Illinois in 2000. Bobby Rush won. He served in the House of Representatives from Illinois, from the 1st District, from 2001. He announced his retirement last year in 2023. But he's the only politician to ever beat Barack Obama. It's 7:22. That ends my presentation. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Before you speak, let me say that this slide, I was mindful of the time. Appreciate y'all so much for coming out, and I didn't want to keep you up at 11 o'clock. But in going back and putting together slides like this and focusing on unsung heroes of the civil rights movement, I could have added another 100. And maybe next year we do this again, I'll give you another one. But there are so many people whose names simply not recorded. But Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers, they were not the only ones who gave their lives. A lot of folk did, men and women.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pratt. God bless you. We did want to leave some time for some questions. That was a lot of information right there. And did anybody learn anything? Oh, my goodness.
God bless you.
Any questions?
Somebody asked one.
Where is your book found on this very same thing?
Pardon?
Where can I find this book?
This is not, what I gave tonight is not, this is a slideshow presentation, but I have authored books. My first book was on called The Color That Scanned Race and Education in Richmond, Virginia. It's an examination of the history of segregation in Richmond, Virginia, where I grew up in the 1960s. Virginia is north of Georgia, but in every sense, it's a southern state. You go down Monument Avenue, all the Confederate generals are lined up. The capital of the Confederacy was in Richmond after they moved it from Montgomery because they got tired of mosquitoes eating them up. But Richmond was capital Confederacy. And in every respect, it's southern. As Malcolm X once said, everything south of Canada is south. Make no mistake. Second book I did was on the We Shall Not Be Moved, the Desegregation University of Georgia. And the most recent book was on Selma's Bloody Sunday. So I have a book that's entitled, that's focused explicitly and specifically on the Selma campaign in 1965. And I'm in the process of doing a biography of Fred Gray. Lots of things I would like to do, but I'm getting close to retirement now. I don't know how much, it's a whole lot of work, archives, but interviewing people And one of the things that's made my work so interesting is that anybody who's doing a history of the Civil War, you've got a person tomorrow night, I think Dr. Berry, that's his special Civil War. All those cats are dead. But you still have some folk who are still alive in civil rights, and so much of my work focuses on oral histories. And I sit in front of them and I do the oral interviews. I did not mention that James Lawson, the civil rights activist who got King to come to Memphis, James Lawson is one of the few that's still alive. He's 95. He's 95, Fred Gray is 93. They're about the only two that's left from that era. Most of those folk are gone, which is why the interviews that I've done with them, I interviewed John Lewis a couple times before he died a few years ago, C.T. Vivian. And so doing the civil rights work and interviewing these people and getting their stories has been so enriching. You sit at the feet of these people and just to listen to them tell you what they endured during that time. It's hard to imagine. It's really hard to believe. Anybody else have a question? Yes?
Okay, we all know that lynching was prominent in Southern states, but reading, especially some of the works of Allen Wells, why is it not mentioned in a lot of literature that there was great lynching in northern states also?
Northern states have tried to divorce themselves from it. They tried to paint themselves in many respects as sort of the promised land, the saviors of society, but we know that is not true. The largest, the state with the largest Klan chapter outside of the South was in Indiana. Indiana was a terribly racist state. They had a grand wizard named David Stevenson. And what was so dangerous about the Klan in Indiana and some of these other northern states is that they did not just go around with the white sheets and the hoods beating up black folk, but they inserted themselves into politics. They got into government. They put their buddies on courts as judges. The same thing we're seeing doing right now. Look at the House of Representatives. There was a picture yesterday of Mike Johnson, who is the current Speaker of the House, cozied up next to Donald Trump. The House Republicans are taking all the cues from Donald Trump. They don't want the border issue resolved. They don't want aid to Ukraine because Ukraine is Putin's enemy and Putin is Donald Trump's buddy. So, and that's how the Klan in those northern states work. So the reason that you haven't seen much about it written is that they were more clandestine. They didn't go out on horseback like they did in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi and pull black folk out of the bed. That was not the way they murdered people. They were a little slicker. They said, we'll get into politics and we will sentence young black boys to life in prison for petty crimes. So that's how the Klan and out of those states work. And that's why you don't see it. That's why you have the push right now in Florida by Ron, my wife calls him D-Satan, DeSantis in Florida, who is trying to ban books, telling people that black folk had learned some benefits from slavery, they learned some trades. Well, if you can teach us trades, teach us how to be educators and lawyers and doctors. Go all the way, don't just stop at trades. But that's his message right now. You've got Nikki Haley on the campaign trail saying that America's never been a racist country. Well, she's right. She's right. America has never been a racist country if you take out segregation and slavery and Jim Crow and lynching and a whole lot of other stuff. We won't even talk about the Indians. See, because the intent for black folk was exploitation. The end game for Native Americans was extermination. Right. There ain't no way we're going to kill them. Okay. So that's a whole nother lecture. But if you take all that stuff out, Nikki Haley's right.
So were there more sundown towns in the north than in the south?
I don't know that there were more. I can't say there were more, but there were plenty. One of the biggest shocks, and you all know this, many of you, Ms. Yule and I, One of the biggest shocks that Martin Luther King had was when he went to Chicago. When he carried his Southern movement to Chicago, he said he saw hatred on the faces of white people. As he tried to integrate housing in Chicago, he said he saw a level of hatred in Chicago he had never seen on the meanest sheriff in Mississippi. Go back and watch some footage of King's campaign in Chicago. He was almost killed in Chicago. That's how bad those races were in that city. And it was a virulent kind of racism. And he left Chicago shell-shocked. And that's when he began to talk about the triple evils of society: racism, poverty, and war. And once he came out against the Vietnam War, that ended his cozy relationship with Lyndon Johnson, because Vietnam was LBJ's baby. He wanted that. But King said, I've come to the position that before I was a civil rights leader, I was a minister of the gospel. And I ain't gonna study war no more. He realized that war in Vietnam was wrong, killing innocent people. He believed what Muhammad Ali said. Ain't no Vietnamese ever called me nigger. Yes, sir.
Dr. Pratt, such a great job. I kind of feel sad and embarrassed because there were so many peoples up there that I never heard of. So, especially that, and I can't remember her name, she was the heavyset lady with the little bluish dress on. Yeah, I knew her, but I just didn't know how much she had in the movement. You told a little about her. I've read about her, but you shared something different about her. So where can I find all this information on the different faces that I've never known, like the tall man that looked like my daddy? And, where can we find this information? I know we study Black history. I've read books. I've had history. But the people you have shown us tonight, some of them are totally blank to me. And I feel sad that I didn't know that as old as I am.
That was the objective of the lesson.
True, and I thank you for it.
That's you're welcome. I deliberately left off names because I wanted to see, and I could have given this lecture without a PowerPoint, but it wouldn't have made it wouldn't have been the same. You needed to see people, which is why the PowerPoint is so important to this. And so what I plan to do when I go back over the next few days, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and I'm going to put names on it. And anybody who wants a copy of it, I'm glad to share it with you. It's all about learning. And I've been teaching at the University of Georgia for 37 years. I joined the faculty in 1987. I was the first Negro in the history department. UGA was founded in 1785. It took them 202 years to hire a Negro in the history department. Well, on 2 occasions I was mistaken for the janitor, but that's another story. I wasn't mad. I mean, they had never seen a black person over there before, so, they saw me, they thought I was janitor. But every time I teach my classes, I learn something different because I'm constantly researching, I'm constantly looking at stuff, I'm constantly digging out tidbits of information, stuff I never knew. So don't feel, if you think you feel bad now, wait till I come back. you may be suicidal. No. No, there is a lot of stuff. And the reason you don't know it, Ms. Hall, is because it's not taught. Students in my class know it. They see this PowerPoint. But you don't know it because it wasn't taught in your school.
And it's not easily found.
It's not easily found. You got to know what you're looking for to find it. And so I've had students come up to me. I was teaching, this has been 15, 20 years ago. I was teaching on the Klan in the South doing Reconstruction. And I saw a white male student. He was visibly upset. He was turning all shades of red, and I could see tears in his eyes. And I would tell him that our Klan would come in and how they were lynching people and stuff and dragging them out of the bed. And after class, I thought this cat may want to shoot me or something. After class, he came up. And he said, "Can I see you?" I said, "Yes." He came to the office. And he said, I was about 8 or 9 years old. and I went to visit my grandparents for the summer and went in my granddaddy's closet. And I saw the whole outfit, the sheet, the hood, all that stuff. It brought it home to him. He had never thought about the Klan and lynching and all that stuff, but on this particular occasion, it's real to him. I've had students come up and say they never knew about events that took place in their hometown. There were, all over this country, there had been race riots, there had been lynchings. In Wilmington, North Carolina, that was a coup. Black folk were in charge of the city government in Wilmington, North Carolina. Black people, white people came in after the election and started killing all the black office holders, drove the others out of town, burned buildings. This happened in 1898. I gave the lecture one day, a white student walked up, I'm from Wilmington, never knew about it. I said, but they've got a reason not to want to teach you. That is the primary impetus behind these book bans, trying to restrict information. And when, integration was good, it did what it had to do, I guess. But there was a time when we learned more under segregation. Because for the first 6 years of my education, my school was all black. All white students, all black teachers, all black students, all black administrators. And our teachers taught us black history. Much of the stuff that I've learned about Paul Robeson and Ida B. Wells, my black teachers taught me in 5th, 6th grade. Once our school was integrated, they stopped teaching it. They say it's sensitive. The black principal that we had became the assistant principal. They brought in a new white principal. He went around pulling books off the shelves. He pulled off Richard Wright's Black Boy, Native Son, James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Claude Brown's Man-Child in the Promised Land. He pulled it off. He pulled off what he knew, but what he didn't know was when he pulled it off, the black librarian took it in her office. She didn't throw it out. And I would walk into the library and she said, Robert, come here. And she called me in her office. She said, you might want to take a look at this. My black librarian, God rest her soul, Ann Carey, she had to sneak books to black students. It's in the 70s. That's how it was. And that's what we're going back to. If we ain't careful. Because these white folk, the Republican Party, they're on a mission. They are on a mission. Believe it. Believe it. Any other questions? Got time for one more? I don't want to drag this out. Yes, sir. Oh. Mm-hmm. That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. When we think of the Black Panther Party, actually the Black Panther Party for self-defense, because a lot of folk leave off that part. They're really organized for self-defense. We think of Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in Oakland, 66. But the year before in Lowndes County, that's the original Black Panther. Although Steve Byrd may say something different. He's got a Black Panther of his own. But the modern-day Black Panther Party was in Lowndes. Alabama, Lowndes County. Lowndes County. There are lots of other people that were important in this movement who gave their lives for the cause. And I mean, they committed life, which is why I cannot understand. I'm going to take this last minute to get on my soapbox and why we cannot get our folks to register and vote. I hear this crazy talk, and I'm seeing some crazy numbers about the numbers of black men who are defecting from the Democratic Party and going to vote for Trump. How crazy do you have to be? How crazy do you have to be as a black man when those 5 young black boys, 4 black, 1 Latino, in New York, you know what I'm talking about? Accused of raping this white woman? Donald Trump took out a 4-page ad calling for them to be executed. Now, years down the road, somebody else admitted to the crime, and his DNA proved that it was him who had done it. Donald Trump issued no apology. You call for the execution of 5 innocent, 4 black, 1 Latino. That's Donald Trump. And that's who black folk want to vote for? It must be something in the atmosphere. Maybe something in the water. But I just, I can. Now, to be fair, Joe Biden will have to straighten up, because you cannot, on the one hand, say you don't like what Israel is doing to those poor folk in Gaza, but you regular funding Israel. That's just why you got, what's the name, the congresswoman to leave in Michigan urging people in Michigan to vote against Biden in the primary. So Biden's got to, he's going to have to cut bait one way or the other. And this issue in Gaza is going to be a potential albatross around his neck, because he's going to lose some crucial Arab Americans. Arab Americans make up a considerable percentage of the Michigan vote. And this election in 2024 may come down to Michigan and Philadelphia. So all about black folk getting out in Detroit, in Philly, Atlanta. Same scenario 4 years ago. And so if we don't organize and get the vote out, I shudder to think what this country would look like for 4 more years of Trump. I don't know that we could survive it. And if he gets in there for 4 more years, then it's probably going to be war. But no, not with Russia, because Russia is his buddy, but internally. But it's up to us to make that move. I mean, if these folk that I showed you tonight could give their lives, if Leroy Moulton could survive by lying in the field and playing dead while you got 4 or 5 Klansmen standing on top of you with guns, hell, at least I can do is vote. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pratt, and we got just a little taste of what his students get every single day at UGA. Thank you so much. Give him a big round of applause one more time for Dr. Robert Pratt. I had the awesome privilege to do an independent study with Dr. Pratt about a year ago. And it was a powerful experience for me. Are there, I do want to put it out, we got a couple of minutes if there are any questions whatsoever. I do have a question about this Michael Lewis King. Anybody know who that is? Michael Lewis King. Anybody know who that is? Right here, we have one. Anybody in the back? Michael Lewis King. That's right. Martin Luther King, Jr. It was not until he was 5 years old that his name became Martin Luther King. His father went to Germany and learned about Martin Luther, the great Reformationist, and he changed his name. Because he was Michael Lewis King Sr. When he changed his name, Dr. King, his name was changed as well. And it wasn't until 1957, King was born in 29. It wasn't until 1957 that his birth certificate was changed to reflect his name change. So that's a little civil rights knowledge for you. I have a book that has a lot of King's documents in it, and it has letters in it from people like Wyatt T. Walker, King's right-hand man, who several letters he would write back to King from Petersburg, Virginia, where he was pastoring the Guilford Baptist Church, and he would send letters back to his friend Mike. Mike, how you doing? Mike, we'll see. I'm thinking, who is Mike? And a little research revealed that it was Dr. King. It was Dr. King. And I'm so glad that you did mention the fact that while he was standing here talking about some history makers, we were hearing from a history maker at the University of Georgia. Though if you go to the library, the main library, there's a picture of Dr. Pratt. No, in the Miller building, the Miller Learning Center, there's a picture of Dr. Pratt with a note on it that he was the first black professor in the history department in 202 years before they found a worthy. They did get a light-skinned brother, though. They got a light-skinned brother. They couldn't get a dark skin. You got a light-skinned brother with good hair. You know, that's all right. They probably didn't know it until after they hired him. But God bless you. Thank you so much. Remember, tomorrow night we have one of his colleagues from the history department. I'm not really sure why a religion guy spending so much time in the history department, but but it has been an enriching experience for me. But I also had an opportunity about a year and a half ago. My area of interest and research is all in post-Reconstruction and developing black positive identity. And so I needed to know something about the Civil War. So I took a class from Dr. Stephen Berry, who will be here to lecture tomorrow. And I'll ask him to talk a little bit about this before he gets into the core of his discussion. But I never had a lot of respect for Abraham Lincoln. For me, I always carried the Lerone Bennett. I believe it was Lerone Bennett who wrote Forced into Glory. That Lincoln he had to do what he had to do. But it was sitting in Dr. Berry's class and all of the readings, the letters, the books, where I learned that Lincoln could at any time, for much of the Civil War, the South was giving the North everything they could handle, and beating the North in many ways. Through the Civil War, the South had one general. The North had 5. Because none of them could deal with Robert E. Lee until Ulysses Grant showed up. I share that because at any point over those first 3 years of the Civil War, Lincoln could have just thrown in the towel to say, hey, I'm not going to risk the nation. I'm not going to do it. But for black rights, he was a racist, Lincoln was, who said in a debate in 1858 with Stephen Douglas, when assigning superiority to race, I do so to the white man first. But he did not think that slavery was right. And he risked the nation on behalf of black rights. He continued to fight a war that the North was losing by and large. And as is the case in the concession speech by Robert E. Lee, it was due to the excessive resources of the North. And part of those excessive resources, it was black folk who were fighting for their own freedom. So we're going to hear from Dr. Berry tomorrow. He's one of the South's leading Civil War experts, and he's written a book about a brother named Prince Rivers, who not only fought in the war, but he was also the mayor of a town called Hamburg. And we're going to hear all about that tomorrow. I'm excited about it. For those who did not sign in tonight, we need everybody to sign, because everybody who comes all 3 nights will receive a certificate on the last night. Not the folk who are streaming, just the folk who showed up in person. We will be. I've had at least 3 people while you were talking to say, Pastor, we got to do more of this. We got to do more of this. And we absolutely will. We absolutely will. We're excited about this, looking forward to it. I'm so thankful to each of you for coming out tonight. And we are going to respect your time. It's 7:50. If I was preaching a sermon, I'd be rounding out the second point right about now. I got one more, but we got all the points we can stand tonight. So God bless you. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And if you don't mind standing where you are so that we can pray out. And if you will, please join me one more time in thanking Dr. Robert Pratt. Yeah.
Dr. Angela Benson, thank her too.
All right. We want to thank his personal assistant. He's taking her to UGA with him. They're going to go on the road with this presentation right here. And it's all funded by Ron DeSantis. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for being God and being God all by yourself. We thank you, oh God, for never, ever forgetting about us. You promised never to forsake us, never to leave us alone, oh God. We thank you, oh God, that you have been right there with us at all times. Even standing in the shadow, oh God, you never allowed us to lose our contact with you as a people, and we thank you. We thank you for great minds, oh God, down through the years, including the one that we've heard from tonight. We pray that you would anoint afresh the mind, the heart, and the will of Dr. Robert Pratt, that he might continue to plant the seeds that will one of these days take root, oh God, and harvest time may not be yet. But sooner or later, oh God, somebody is going to remember what Dr. Pratt did for them. God, we thank you for your son, Jesus. We thank you for the power, the presence, and the possibility of the Holy Spirit. Now go with us as we leave this place, but never ever from your presence. And we will be careful to give you all the praise, the honor, and the glory. In Jesus' name and for his sake, amen.